Welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m., both here in the building, live stream online. So whether you're in Bristol or far away, you can join us in this conversation. My name is Celia. I'm a network producer here at the studio. I'm a white Mediterranean woman that has a very colorful cardigan and pinkish trousers and a lot of hair, a lot of wavy hair. Every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for an Open Studio Friday. We offer you the chance to spend time in the space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. till 5 p.m. And especially a big welcome to those who are new to the studio. Anyone new to the studio here? Or everyone? Oh, we have all people that are familiar with what we do. But for those online who might be new to the studio, just a bit of an introduction of who we are and what we do. We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creative and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. It's a partnership between Watershed, UWI Bristol and University of Bristol and founded by Arts Council England. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events, opportunities to our residents as part of our spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. We're a space for people who take risks with embryonic ideas and to make time for collaboration. A few notes before we begin. Feel free to move around, make a cup of tea in the kitchen over there, grab a glass of water. We have a quiet space next door that probably everyone here is familiar with, so feel free to use it. Fire exits are either at the end of the studio, and one of the studio team will direct you if we need to go there. Accessible toilets and baby chains can be found in the corridor next to the kitchen as well. There will be a Q&A at the end of the talk, and for those watching online, pop your questions on the YouTube chat. Vic will be your voice in the room today. And if you are in the building, please raise your hands at the end. And we'll send around a microphone for those at home can hear you through YouTube with a microphone. You can get news on all our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PMS Studio UK on Twitter, at PMS Studio, at mastodon.social on Mastodon, and at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. And our speaker today is Ben Joseph Andrews, and Ben is a disabled new media artist and researcher from Wathaurong land in Australia, often in collaboration with Emma Roberts. His practice uses emerging technologies to expand perceptions, reawaken curiosity, and instill a sense of wonder in the world we inhabit. Today, he's going to talk about the inherent liminality of XR and how a seamed creative approach can help communicate disability as an altered or expanded form of embodiment. And please join me to give a very, very warm welcome to Ben.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, my name's Ben. I use he, him pronouns. I'm wearing a navy blue corduroy shirt. I've got a moustache and flowing, untamed forest of brown curly hair. And to complete the very kind of 70s look, I've also got some kind of rose-coloured blue light filter glasses for this talk. So nice to be back in Bristol. I'm so glad to be here. Actually, in 2019, when I first kind of travelled overseas to show off kind of the new media work that I was creating, I came to Pervasive and came to a lunchtime talk. So it feels like kind of like a really nice kind of full circle moment. I love Bristol. I'm terrified by the seagulls here. I did not know seagulls could be the size that they are here. They're genuinely terrifying. So yeah, I've been working in new media and VR since 2016, so it's quite some time. Mostly in kind of performance-driven context, so kind of situating like that VR headset within like a wider kind of performance methodology, often with kind of multi-sensory kind of composition and multi-room experiences, kind of almost more like immersive theatre, often kind of non-narrative pieces. So I'm going to talk for around 40 minutes, perhaps, covering a little bit about my creative practice and my interests with VR, how I've kind of gone on a bit of a like journey with the technology, and how that kind of has interacted with my personal life, and how that's kind of come to inform my current work. So the only other thing to say is that, yeah, I'm from Australia. I'm based in Wathaurong country, which is kind of situated northwest of Melbourne, for those that know Australia. And yeah, so a lot of my creative practice occurs on those unceded Aboriginal lands. So the first work I wanted to just talk a little bit about is Starless from 2017. So this is one of those works that really explores situating the VR headset into a kind of performance context. When I started in film, so one thing I will actually also say before getting into all of this is that I often work very collaboratively. So these projects are the kind of sum of a lot of different creative collaborations with different artists, most prominently with my kind of partner in crime and co-creator Emma Roberts, who would normally do the talk alongside me, but she's back in Australia sorting out a visa problem. So it is just me. But all of these works are co-created with Emma, as well as a bunch of other artists such as Erin Taylor and Matt Fasandia. So yeah, when I kind of came into VR in 2016 from kind of filmmaking practice, I was really interested in how the headset shifted a bunch of things, but most prominently like the kind of audience. That is like how the audience were in a physical space with a headset on, and that there was this kind of plasticity of space around the audience that could remain static, of course, and often does, but could also become kind of harnessed and mobilized and become dynamic. And through that, the experience could take place somewhere in between what one is seeing visually or hearing orally, but also what is happening within the space around you that is in this kind of amorphous and rich kind of liminal space. So I guess to sum it up, I was really interested in how the headset is both a screen and a blindfold, and has this inherently kind of dual function. And for me, immersion in VR is always this kind of strange occurrence where you're both present somewhere that you're not and absent somewhere that you are. And a lot of this kind of early work was kind of exploring a methodology for creating work that's very specific to that kind of liminal space. So I'll show you a quick video of Starless. Essentially, it is a multi-room immersive near-death experience. It's using the archetypes of the near-death experience. Most prominently, the idea of this kind of tunnel of light that you move towards. Non-narrative piece, no voiceover, very little information as to like what the actual experience or the archetype was. But it was kind of almost remediating the tunnel of light to also double as a walk into a live quadraphonic performance. And quadraphonic is an incredibly beautiful and interesting immersive medium. You've got 4 speakers, essentially, and there is like a central spot. And once you enter that central spot, the sound ceases to come from like directional as you're moving towards it to this kind of omnidirectional place within it. So I'll play you this video now. So a lot of this earlier work was really interested in kind of mapping the liminal space of this kind of in-between state to the idea of awe as a concept, as a kind of state, an affective state that is kind of an encounter with some kind of vastness that is, perhaps it could be a visual vastness, or it could be a conceptual vastness, or it could be a kind of just like an overwhelming sense of feeling or presence. Because, obviously kind of interacting with the headset as a blindfold often brings with it this kind of inherent sense of vulnerability, because I think we feel very vulnerable when, our kind of senses are kind of shuttered in the way that they are in the headset. So a lot of this work was kind of gearing towards awe and wonder. But this piece was really interested also in the idea of sensory incongruity. So what you're seeing inside the headset doesn't actually correspond to what is happening outside. So you're kind of walking along these different kind of textures that are changing as you're walking. It's going from a spongy texture into sand. You've got a sense of wind, a sense of heat. And that there's this kind of mismatch. And through the mismatch, I guess, the idea is that the audience must construct that experience as a kind of a set of sensations that is, very much experiential and very much kind of open. And this kind of creative work has also informed my practice-led PhD research, which kind of explores what I kind of define this state as something called the gloom, where it's a mixture of this darkness that the headset actually opens out onto by kind of shuttering our eyes and often our ears, and kind of changes the way that physical space appears to us. But obviously the headset is also inherently a very bright medium that's strapped to the bridge of your nose. So I'm really kind of interested in this kind of space. But I must say that I've kind of got a very different relationship now with this phase of work. It's really easy to kind of actually look back at kind of pieces like Starless and see how this kind of fascination with sensory mismatch was also mirroring my own kind of latent experience at the time with a chronic disability that I have called vestibular migraine, which is a kind of subset of migraine, but not the classical migraine that might be kind of pain dominant and episodic. Vestibular migraine is chronic. It's every day, 24/7. And essentially it is a migraine that affects the vestibular system, senses of balance, senses of motion, senses of orientation. The world is no longer this kind of static thing, but this very dynamically moving thing. It also incorporates within its set of very wide phenomena various kind of interesting things that really, when I look back to Starless, are very fascinating. Olfactory hallucinations, so kind of hallucinations of smell, sensations of being misproportioned in an environment, or a misproportioned embodiment, also known as Alice in Wonderland syndrome. The sense of world lacking solidity, being able to move, feeling like you can move phenomenally through objects that should be kind of solid and dense. And back then, these weren't things that I was actually drawing upon consciously, but I can kind of see now how much they manifested unconsciously through so much of my kind of creative and artistic pursuit of liminality. So vestibular migraine is something that I've been kind of formally diagnosed with the last few years. I've always had a chronic migraine condition in all of my adult life, but more and more so, it was becoming less bordered between on and off states and more kind of amorphous and kind of ceaseless. And essentially how I normally describe vestibular migraine is kind of having synesthesia, but for motion. So things that I look at or hear or touch or smell, my body converts into signals of movement, like ways that I'm moving in the world, but I'm actually not moving. So for example, if I look at the trees bending out that window, my body kind of becomes the movement of the branches as they're kind of bending, or the rippling of the leaves. It's a very kind of porous relationship to the world. And it did, it kind of got out of control for a long time. And funnily enough, virtual reality is one of my biggest triggers, in that it kind of maps onto your sense of movement, but not precisely. So it's kind of giving signals that are false. But my body's already kind of very open to signals that are false and making up signals, phantom signals. So at the time I was finishing off a very large VR, XR, multisensory work called Gondwana, which is about a 4-year project. And towards the very tail of that production, it just became so hard to be able to look at kind of builds of the work, because the motion sickness or the sense of motion that it would give me would leave me unable to stand up, sometimes for days, sometimes for much longer than that. And after Gondwana, I kind of vowed never to work in VR again. I said, screw this VR business. I really like the British saying it's pants. And for me, VR was absolute pants. And I kind of never wanted to see the headset, let alone put it on or create something for it again. And essentially, I took kind of like a long period of leave taking where I had to kind of readdress a lot of things in my life with how this condition was affecting me. I sought lots of different treatments. Migraine kind of evolves over time, so you can have preventative measures that work quite well for a period of time, but it kind of escapes them. It kind of like grows through the guards. And I had to kind of reset a lot of things with how I approached, very basic things with my lifestyle, but also took on a whole new appreciation for this very multi-system, multifarious thing called vestibular migraine. And I kind of realized during this period of time that if I can't hide or persevere through this thing like I was, I was kind of very much shielding it from my personal and professional life and kind of pretending it wasn't there, which for those that have disability is not usually a very good way of going about it. And during this time, I kind of decided that if I can't hide it, I may as well pursue it creatively. And I kind of decided that why not explore the various kind of phenomena of vestibular migraine, which are often kind of phenomena of misembodiment, through kind of new medium, through interactive kind of methodologies. And this kind of began a pursuit for developing what I call an emergent aesthetics of motion misperception. I'm just going to stop that very ominous music now. So the first piece that I created in this kind of open creative research terrain, I guess, was a piece called House Unmoored, filmed entirely within my house and projected onto cloth. And this was a multi-channel video piece that kind of, its images would warp and bend and distort over time based on the migraine journal data that I inputted into the system. So every kind of minute or so, it would change to the next day of that journal that would have various kind of data points as to like severity of the kind of symptoms, a kind of direction that I felt like I was moving in, often many at once and in very impossible ways. And so this piece kind of just like would morph and kind of change based on it was kind of like putting the migraine into this kind of audio-visual system that would kind of somewhat visualize it, or at least kind of bring it to life. And during this kind of time, I realized that I was having like lots of conversations trying to explain this really heightened, expanded, strange form of motion perception. But like smell, motion is really hard to describe in words. It's a very kind of amorphous and slippery sensation. So essentially I was having a lot of conversations like this one. And for those that might recognize this voice, it's Paul Tyler.
And when you use the word movement, so if you can, I mean, if you can see the table, you might need to dip the and this is not mapping out your story, okay? This is just mapping out your kind of thesis, as it were. When you're talking about movement, and here we have someone who is moving, and then here is the world around them, okay, if you can see it, and the world around them occasionally moves because, like, for example, trees moving. Are you incorporating, when you use the word movement there, are you also incorporating the perception of other stuff that somehow impacts on our movement? Because I was just thinking about how broad, you know, how sort of, I'm trying to understand these sort of circles, as it were, you know, as to how limited these circles are in terms of what you mean by the word movement. And it seems like you're sort of suggesting that movement also incorporates, for want of a better word, the perception of other things that impact on our movements. And I didn't know if that's what you really meant.
So normally, you know, we would kind of hear a conversation kind of like this, whereas perhaps Paul is a small circle and I'm the large circle. And I was kind of realizing that like there's like this kind of border of information kind of like that's only like linguistically possible to communicate in certain ways. So I was kind of like interested in how to explore different ways of kind of communicating that. So for me, the kind of conversation like that doesn't really appear in this kind of like very kind of binary object-subject kind of relation, but kind of a little bit more like this.
And when you use the word movement, so if you can, when you're talking about movement, and here we have someone who's moving, here's the world around you, and the world around are you incorporating, when you use the word, are you incorporating the perception of sexual stuff that somehow impacts? Because I'm just thinking about how broad, you know, how
I can keep just speeding them up, but I guess you get the point that for me, I was starting to become interested in like how to use, like different kind of interactive technologies and just kind of like strange lo-fi techniques, I guess, to kind of visualize stuff that that was really hard to, let me just turn off this. Really hard to kind of describe through words. And more and more during this period of time, I kind of found myself strangely coming back to virtual reality. And in a really kind of like, often not because I wanted to actually create something in that technology early on, but because it was a touchstone for various forms of misembodiment that for people who had been in a VR headset could probably use as a bit of a anchor point, you know. So when the headset fails and the tracking unsettles, I was like, that is close to how my body feels like it's kind of stretching into the distance. So like when your controllers lose tracking and suddenly they just kind of drift away from you. That was like such a strong, phenomenal touch point for this kind of sense of like elasticity that I was experiencing. And it kind of made me start to think around, like, along with Emma, we were having like these kind of long conversations around the technology. And through these kind of conversations, we started to like realize that the headset is kind of like interesting because it's attempting to map one sense of embodiment, but like often not doing it entirely correctly. And I think that with like these kind of embodied technologies, we often talk around this kind of idea of seamlessness, but they're not seamless. In fact, they're often seamed. You know, the headset literally is quite seamed in the way that it shutters the eyes. It has got a strong seam, but also it's seamed in the sense that these things don't kind of always, they're not as kind of continuous and fluid as they like to think they are. And I found myself coming back to the headset because in a lot of key ways, the headset, this thing here, is a kind of a proxy brain that, like, through its kind of plasticity of wires and data, reveal to us not only the ways that we kind of perceive our perceptions, but how these perceptions can be made to stretch and expand, and a kind of like an eerie kind of like embodiment that's in flux and it's elastic. And I think why this is kind of particularly interesting for vestibular migraine is that while we often think of VR in terms of its kind of visual or interactive affordances, less often do we consider how the headset is at its like very core a fundamentally vestibular device, right? It like relies on the constant detection and processing of movement in order to know accurately where you are in space, how you're oriented, where you're looking, where you're positioned. And to make things a little hard for myself, I thought I would break that down a little bit for you. So you've probably heard the term 6 degrees of freedom, which is essentially the various axes that track movement on the headset. And they are these axes. We have, let me just recenter this. We have yaw, which is kind of, if I was wearing this headset, which I'm not going to, left to right. I kind of always remember this as yaw, opening a door. We have pitch, which is essentially looking up or looking down. I remember this one as it's kind of like a picture when you pour. Then there's roll, which is kind of like ear to shoulder. Then there's heave, which is kind of like moving all the way off, up, and moving down. There's surge, which is kind of moving like kind of through space, I guess on the Z axis. And finally, there's sway, which is either not working or it's gone to sleep. It's not working, but essentially that is left to right. And these kind of seem simple enough when looked at in isolation, but in reality, they're all kind of working together in concert with one another, except sway. it's checked out. And I think what's really interesting about this is what we can see on this kind of diagram. Oh no, it is there. Oh, it needs to be over here. What we can see on this diagram is that even if I do something very simple, like kind of turn my head, not one of these axes moves on its own, but they're all kind of moving together in this kind of sympathetic system where one moves and there's kind of counter movement on other axes. And I guess what you might know is how closely the 6 degrees of freedom actually mirrors the vestibular labyrinth of the human inner ear. So our bodies have 3 semicircular canals in the inner ear which detect rotation, so like things like yaw, pitch, and roll, while the neighbouring otolithic organs, the utricle and the saccule, work in concert to relay signals of linear acceleration, so heave, sway, and surge. So actually what we're looking at when we make the data from the headset visible, the 6 degrees of freedom, is a little window into the way that our own body is inputting and outputting movement. How it's kind of trying to construct a kind of fluid and seamless sense of embodied space. And kind of like, we became really interested in these kind of like the way that the headset is kind of technologically and biologically like intertwined, and that there's like something in that kind of intertwining that is kind of like a fascinating and kind of a rich ground. But obviously, you know, it goes without saying that like my kind of signals don't quite move so fluidly. Mine kind of warp and bend and kind of overlap with one another and behave in kind of strange, odd ways. And, you know, during a kind of flare-up, the more I move, the more kind of I input into that movement, into that system, the more things just break down, like sway, for example, which is just not moving anymore at all. And so this kind of like looking at the headset in this kind of more deconstructive and critical way as a kind of like a parallel, but also one that is kind of like inherently not as seamless as it kind of makes it out to be. I kind of became like really interested in like kind of just experiments, lo-fi experiments around how to explore this. I'm not going to show too many of these because we're running a little bit low on time. So this is just a couple of like little experiments that we did early on when kind of exploring this. This is kind of remediating the kind of fairground attraction, the tunnel vortex, or spinning tunnel, I think it might be called, where it's like you've got two planes, a bridge that you're walking on that's static, and then you've got this kind of like cylinder that's rotating, that's moving, and essentially it creates a conflict in the vestibular system that makes it feel like the bridge is moving and not the ceiling. So we're kind of making it really hard on ourselves, and that was quite an intense thing, as you can imagine. We were also kind of interested in how to like kind of make visible the, or in this case, audible, the various kind of like axes of movement that you're engaging at any given moment. So this is kind of very basic, just like one audio input that's modulating based on, how you're moving. This is Emma, by the way. She can't be here, but it's not a live camera from our house. But so yeah, really kind of interested. I will say as well, this is our first time. We've often worked in teams with programmers, well, small teams with single programmer, and often we've kind of worked through collaboration with that kind of technical coding. We haven't really done so much ourselves, but this project, especially because of its like autobiographical nature, I realized that like I needed to be able to like create stuff myself to kind of explore this for to be able to like kind of draw upon my own experience in wielding these kind of embodied technologies, and particularly kind of like exploring how they can give us these, open up a world that expanded motion perception kind of becomes tangible, I guess. So this experiment is using a leap motion camera, which is like an infrared hand sensor, but for some reason we're actually using the camera out of it, which is like this super strange wide angle fisheye perspective. And essentially we were kind of adding kind of like this kind of this delay effect. So as you moved through space, you would have like all these kind of trailing hands. And this one in particular was really interesting to us because it became the kind of bed, I guess, or at least like the idea behind this got developed and transformed into the first kind of completed piece, which was called Turbulence, Jamais Vu, which exhibited last year in premiere at IDFA. And essentially this is a mixed reality piece that uses a camera on the front of the headset. Similar-ish to what we just saw with these kind of trailing effects. It allows you to see your own hands in an environment. This environment is a desk that's kind of loosely modeled on my own desk. And it's exploring the phenomenon of derealization. So I'm not sure if you've heard, there's like this idea of the migraine aura that like a lot of people see. It's usually a visual aura for a lot of migraineurs that through the ages have had like kind of spiritual connections with divinity, and often is the precursor to the like storm of the migraine. And it's usually this kind of moment of reverie, I guess you could describe it. My migraine aura is something called derealization, where essentially I know that I'm in for like a really bad time when I look in the mirror and I don't recognize myself, and I don't kind of like recognize my own body, my own self, and it kind of unsettles a bunch of things that you would normally kind of not even think about. Like the task of just reaching out and grabbing something is so strange and so weird because it's like encountering that as something new. And this stuff is also kind of called more kind of casually Jamais Vu, which is kind of like an inversion of déjà vu, where déjà vu is like, oh, I feel like I've seen that before. Jamais Vu is never seen. And it kind of refers to this idea that the things that should be familiar to you have suddenly become unfamiliar. So I'm just going to show you a quick trailer of this piece.
Jamais vu. The sudden appearance of reality no longer being real. It's an experience of estrangement that, without warning, defamiliarizes the spaces I inhabit, the people I love, even my relationship to myself. Things feel slippery here, don't they? Things that used to be so easy.
So Jamais Vu, yeah, it takes place at a desk. It's a guided voiceover piece. So you've got headphones on that are kind of like guiding you along the way. It's in my voice. Very strange to kind of work with your own voice, but kind of necessary for this project. And essentially, it's kind of like quite an open experience. So I'm going to just play like a little bit of like a capture of the piece. I won't have the sound on, so it's just kind of more to give you a sense of like the interaction and kind of what's happening, and I'll just kind of narrate a little bit over the top just to give you a sense of it. So essentially it kind of begins with this kind of prompt of grounding and kind of like taking stock of the sense of ground beneath your feet. You kind of put your hands on the desk and you get prompted to kind of just think about that sense of solidity, that sense of density of, you know, the tactile grounding of the hand on the desk. And then the camera turns on and you find yourself in this kind of like strange black and white world. The kind of technique that we're using is kind of like an edge detection process where it kind of drains out the surface texture and color, and it just leaves the edges of things. And for me, that was like a really, it's such an interesting kind of technique because firstly, I found that when I was actually creating this in VR, the removal of a lot of signals of movement. So when you turn, it's just the edges of things. It's not all of the various other stuff. I found that like infinitely more comfortable to work with, like this kind of like austere black and white aesthetic. But also this idea of like the kind of virtuality of your own space and your own hands. And it's like things that are both kind of like, you know that it's your own hand because you're looking at it, but it makes it strange enough that it kind of creates, or at least accentuates the gap with something that felt very phenomenally kind of like true, or at least kind of very resonant. And one thing that I will say is that this is quite a challenging work on an embodied level. And it's challenging because the vision that you're seeing through the headset is flipped on the x-axis. So when you put your hand out and you look towards your hand, you will see it as if you're looking towards your left hand. A lot of people recognize that. If you've got like a ring on, for example, that will like become quite evident. A lot of people go through the experience and not realize that that's taken place. And what that affordance kind of does is that it upsets things on a very fundamental and formative level, like derealization does. It asks you to have to like re-engage with very kind of formative things. And therefore the actual kind of like guided experience through Jamais Vu is, you know, it's open in the sense that like you don't need to really do anything, but the prompts are very simple. Reach out, grab a mug. That task is really, really hard. And in fact, the piece has this kind of choreography that's kind of taking place throughout it, while being kind of very gentle and kind of caring towards you. And it kind of like asks at the very end to kind of grab the mug, and then in that Tupperware, that red Tupperware you can see down there, or this here, there's like pills in it, and it kind of asks you to like find the pills in it, but there's a lot of empty pills packets. And then it asks you to like unscrew them and then put the pills in the cup. And those are kind of like quite simple motor actions that we wouldn't really think twice about normally. But in this piece, I'd say 80 to 90% of participants don't get the pills in the mug. Often they don't find the pills at all. And I think that that's something that's been really, really interesting through this project, is kind of looking at kind of difficulty in new media work, and also looking at this idea of like, I don't know, I think in a lot of kind of interactive video gamey VR spaces, you get like this idea that like the piece has to be completed, is completable or something, like that you have like this kind of sense of mastery over it, that like you will do it and you'll do it correctly. And this piece kind of wanted to like upset that a little bit, and that if you fail, like most people do, you don't feel like, oh, I failed, but like it's kind of part of the experience, and you're coming up against this friction against yourself and against just like trying to override various things. So throughout this kind of process, I was really interested in how to create Jamais Vu. I kind of had to create my own sense of neurology in this kind of interactive engine. Like you have to kind of create the conditions for seeing, and like that's kind of like, I guess, like a normative seeing. And then I had to kind of upset that by kind of adding kind of things along the way. I guess what I can do is show you actually a little bit of that. I probably shouldn't do this, but I'm going to. So this is what I'm seeing right now when I do this talk. If I kind of go into this is kind of the container of, it's really hard to do, of Jamais Vu. And if I delete that and maybe, I shouldn't have clicked that. All right, we're back. So if I don't know really what's going on there. And if I connect this into here, then if we kind of zoom in, we can see that, yeah, this is me. I've now just added that as the input. And then along the way, so if we say that this is like the kind of input of data from whatever source it is, this is now just the webcam here, this is kind of like, it became really interesting to me because this is kind of like how migraine works, right? Is that like the input is kind of correct, but as it's going along the processing chain, it's getting like interrupted and kind of misprocessed in the way that like this kind of path goes all the way through these kind of various effects and chains and processes until you kind of get to this output, which is kind of taking that data and kind of like reprocessing it kind of differently. And I'm going to just cease back control. This idea of kind of like building a kind of like a non-normative neurology in these kind of systems is something that's like really, really interesting, kind of like as through this project of like what I feel like is kind of reclaiming these really hostile and horrid technologies to kind of explore the different kinds of embodiment that they could enable. So I'm just going to end with one last thing. And that is, if I just put this headset, just sit this on the table and wake it up. We see here the unmediated flow of motion data that's coming from the headset. And there's something about it, like this kind of constant detection of movement that's smaller than the eye can see, you know, like it's just sitting on a table, that exposes that stasis itself is this kind of dynamic flux that's composed of these kind of unquantifiable movements. You'll notice it sway, not moving. And so while I've often wanted to turn away from this kind of technology, I kind of now see it more as a window in and a way of exploring what VM really is for me. And that this kind of data echoes my own experience in a lot of ways, that movement in all its kind of multitudes of intensities and velocities is constant. The blood flowing within our body, the ground tilting beneath our feet, the fact that we're hurtling through the universe right now at just incomprehensible speeds. And that perhaps this condition aligns us with something more essential and granular and cosmic, that even stillness and reality itself is ever moving, ever changing, ever becoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Any questions, anyone? Oh, we have one there.
Hi, thanks, Ben. That was really, really interesting from my own point of view. But I have a question from our online audience. What programs are you using for the audio mapping of weird motion effects?
Yeah, so all of this, the presentation as you've seen, Jamais Vu, and all of the prototypes have all been built in Touch Designer, which is a free software. The only limitation is the max resolution. So if you want to do something more than 1280 by 720, you need to. So it's a very fair model, I think, as a technology. It's incredibly powerful. What it's really good at is mixing a lot of different data sources together and using one thing to influence another thing to influence another thing. And obviously for this whole world of Turbulence, this open creative project, that was very much in the spirit of it. But I don't come from a coding background myself, so I found Unity and Unreal like a bit of a barrier to entrance to just get started and just experimenting. So I started with Touch Designer. I spent a couple of months learning it on tutorials, and yeah, I'd like strongly recommend that as a starting point for doing interactive real-time stuff that's, you know, really fun, and it's node-based, so you know you can add Python programming and stuff into it, but you can also just kind of connect things and mix them up in strange ways.
Ooh, I'm going to start here, and I'll make my phone.
Thank you. Hi, Ben. That was amazing and fascinating and beautiful. I was sort of struck by some of what you were showing us about kind of creating these processing and filtering and shifting and kind of bending maneuvers, as next to the sort of language often in tech development around being friction-free, about this sort of quest to be as realistic as possible, for the device to disappear and become invisible, and for everything to be kind of like hyper real as a sort of a destination for technology development. I was wondering what you thought about the role of maybe arts and culture in kind of keeping that trickiness in the mix.
Yeah, I had a great conversation actually with Coral Manton, who I think is is involved at the studio. She came over to Australia and mentored in the very early phases of this project. And we kind of had this great conversation around the smoothing of data. A lot of time when you're working with interactive data, like you saw the stream of the it's like there's so much movement happening at any given moment that the temptation is to smooth that out to make it like less bumpy, less kind of coarse. And I don't know, I found that was like an interesting kind of window into that kind of project, or that kind of assumption that things should be fluid and seamless and that we should remove the friction. And I think on certain levels we should remove some friction, especially in VR, because it is trying to assimilate onto the way that we perceive the world. But also I think that VR is inherently seamed, and I've always explored it as a medium that's a seamed medium. It's got that blindfold duality, which inherently creates this seamed relationship with the physical world. So I think that with a lot of this stuff, whenever you look at the seam, it's a much more rich, much more kind of multiple, much more kind of open medium than assuming that it's seamless. Because I think for a disabled person, often the experience of the world is kind of seamed. So I think it's more true, and it opens up like a different kind of relationship, I think, with the kind of technology or the medium than otherwise would happen if it's kind of like assumed to be this kind of completely immersive thing that kind of will just like somehow eclipse, that barrier, which I don't think is possible. Yeah, the headset wants to have a little break, but I will not let it.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear about how you're, I suppose, approaching not necessarily a kind of like similitude with your own experiences, but kind of like complicating people's own internal relationships with like space and motion and stuff. And I sort of thinking about the capture that you showed of Starless and then the capture of Jamais Vu, I'm really interested in the ways in which there was the people with the kind of the guiding, not like harness, but the sort of tethers on people. Yeah, it was like
elastic, yeah.
Where they're kind of collected and where they're left, and the kind of the use of the voiceover in Jamais Vu. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are around like how you bring people into things, how you hold them throughout, and then how you kind of let them go at the end, and what your kind of thoughts are about that process.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's like, I don't know, as a creator that's, Emma and I from the very beginning have always been interested in the atmospheric experience of this stuff as much as and often it would be sound first. We often work sound first and then build other things onto that. Like the visual trajectory is usually like one of the last pieces to go on. Jamais Vu has been interesting because it was the first piece, and I've found that like a very different creative process. But certainly if we are to believe this technology is immersive, then it needs to be immersive on more counts than just what you see and what you hear and how you move. And I think the setting of place is incredibly important, like how you bring people in to an encounter with, this kind of technology is super important. I think we can learn a lot from like kind of disciplines of theatre and dance and And, with Starless, we kind of adopted this kind of like ritual, like ceremonial aspect where you'd come in. The venue was like in this warehouse that was kind of like slightly hard to find. And we were kind of conscious that people would probably arrive like running a little bit late. And like, the tickets were like, do not run late. You will miss your slot, because it was just so booked. It was so few spaces. And we're kind of conscious that people would arrive a little bit frazzled. And the first thing you do is just take your shoes and socks off and you like wash your feet kind of together to kind of like foreground this kind of sense of tactility that would then occur, in different ways through the experience, through the kind of guiding, through the sand, it also was kind of using like a modulated pass-through, so you could kind of see, but very strangely, in that final space. And how you leave people as well is so essential. Like, the amount of times I've had such beautiful, powerful experiences that are like diminished really strongly by the fact that you take the headset off into this kind of sterile, bright space that kind of eradicates the sensitive, subtle experience that often, the piece is trying to go for. So with Starless, it was really, a lot of the early works, we'd kind of vacate the space that was once full. So when you took off the headset at the end of the encounter, what was once full visual, like kind of like through these glimpses of vision, was now absent, and it was just you and the other people, and like almost like this magic trick, like everyone had kind of just departed, and then the audience would decide when to leave. We'd all be kind of just like hanging backstage, being like, I hope they don't stay too long, like, and just like that kind of thing, I think, especially like with Starless and with Jamais Vu, like they're trying to build this kind of transience, and this kind of feeling of being in this kind of liminal space. And I think as much as the rest of the choreography can like help prime that and help hold that, I think it's incredibly important. And Jamais Vu is interesting because it's, you do take the headset off and then you are still there's a continuity, And what's really fascinating with Jamais Vu is the amount of people that will spend 30 seconds to reset the desk to how it was before they came through. I think as a dual exercise, I think the piece is very caring, it's very vulnerable, it's very intimate. There's an intimacy with voiceover, there's an intimacy with the way that you're kind of interacting and kind of like engaging with the space. And then I think it's also this kind of like uncanny remapping of the experience by kind of almost reversing what you've just done, but like now without the inversion and without the treatment. And those things I think are super special, I think, to like observe that and to like see that there's like this kind of other, there's this transference of care, I think, onto the way that people go through it and the way that people kind of come out of it. And, just like seeing people just like looking at their hands and just moving them after the experience is like really beautiful. That was a long-winded answer, but yeah, very important.
I've got another question from our online audience. Hey Ben, I'm totally new to your work and I'm so pleased to meet you. I've had vestibular migraine, PPPD, for over 20 years. I love that you are showing people how this feels. How can you make the images without triggering your own symptoms? I was not able to watch most of your work. It literally moves me too much, in a good way, but a bad pun from Lucy.
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, it's definitely something that, Jamais Vu is a very kind of like direct experience. It's like it's not simulation because it's like a metaphor for how it actually feels, which is a very ephemeral thing to try to translate. But it is direct, and because of that, we don't recommend it for people, with any kind of vestibular conditions or sensitivities or whatever. And VR in general is pretty inaccessible for anyone with vestibular sensitivities. And so I'm thinking a lot about how to translate this for people that do have vestibular migraine, which is incredibly important to feel seen. This is a condition that is incredibly hard to describe, often misdiagnosed, often occurring in like older women that, historically is the hardest, group to be believed and to receive, adequate treatment. So it's a really kind of like important thing going forward of like how to create these kind of dual aspects that like these works can, you know, deal honestly with the kind of movement I think that I experience, but also do it in a way that can like poetically be translated for those that don't have it. I am lucky that I responded really well to this new migraine treatment that came out, the first treatment to ever be developed specifically for migraine, rather than these like old, you know, antidepressive, anticonvulsant kind of medication. That lowered my floor enough to be able to like do the work that I'm now doing, and I'm very thankful for that. The actual creation of the piece is interesting though, because my system is so porous and so pliable. So that bending effect that you see, like when you kind of move the hand and there's like this kind of delay and it kind of like reforms. When I created that, I was like, oh, it feels so true. Like it feels so true to this sense of like things catching up, but also kind of stretching and kind of behaving erratically. Like it's kind of like, it never kind of like behaves twice the same. So like you can't really get this sense of like how it works because the sense of time is shifting. And I remember just being like, Emma, this is excellent. Like, you know, this is a great metaphor. But what I didn't quite realize is that my vestibular system is so malleable that it saw that over time when I was creating it. And I was like, oh, I can do that. And now actually when I experience flare-ups, I perceive the world in the way that I created the world. And that's just like an interesting thing. So I feel very humbled by that experience, and something that I'm definitely like taking into account as I kind of develop this, and like the amount of exposure that I put myself to these varying effects.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. I think we don't have time for more questions, but
I'm sticking around. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much
for
today's, and all the questions were so interesting as well. Most of you are familiar with the studio that you're here, but if you're sticking around, if you want to talk to anyone of the studio team, and you might not know who everyone is, so if we want to raise our hands, studio team, you can ask about what we do, how we can help you, etc. And if you're at home and you have any questions, or you want to email us at studio@watershed.co.uk. Thank you so much for being today, and see you next time, everyone.